All right, hello everybody. Today, I'm going to be a short one, but what I want to talk about today is an editing exercise that I think is useful for you if you're writing, especially essays. It can be used in fiction, but where it really shines is when writing essays, because there is a tendency for people to overflower or over repeat themselves in essays, or to use words or phrases that add more words onto a thing than actually need to be. This is one of those things where you may want to do it and not necessarily say this is the next draft of my essay, but it is a good exercise to reduce the amount of excess words or unnecessary phrases that you add, especially when you're trying to make a complicated or difficult argument, right? Because you want the argument to be at the forefront of your essay and not the endlessly circular sentences that you decide to craft. I was reading a book by or to call it a book would, I mean, it is a book, but it is a collection of essays by a philosopher named Anthony de Jassé. And one of the things I'm noticing is that he has this tendency to overly extend his sentences in ways that really aren't necessary. And so it made me think about this exercise that I've used before on essays that I've written, and even on stories that I've written, when I was faced with an upper level word limit. And I don't have a clever name for it. You could come up with a clever name for it, like the chainsaw or the guillotine or the whatever. But what it really comes down to is looking carefully at every sentence and every phrase in your essay or your piece of fiction or whatever it is, and looking for anything at all that is redundant or unnecessary in the writing itself. To give you an example, I will go through one paragraph from one of these essays, and what I'm finding is that there's a lot of stuff in here that doesn't really need to be here, because it's either implied by earlier parts of the same darn paragraph, or it overly narrows things when it doesn't need to narrow them either. And that's another thing you need to watch out for, especially in essay writing, is overextending your argument to a point where you make some kind of point where you don't need to make this point to make your argument, and by making this point you end up weakening your argument. So here we go, real quick. Quote, "A draw between arguments for equality and inequality also generates a presumption that is partly, though not wholly, analogous with the three classic ones mentioned above." Now, in this sentence, we already have some stuff. Generates a presumption could simply be presumes. We're doing this we're not doing this for the purposes of necessarily making all of these changes. We just want to, as an exercise, cut as much as possible. That's one of those things where you might want to say generates a presumption instead of presumes, but these two things are actually pretty close to equivalent. So we're going to be extra good at hacking. But then there's this, partly though not wholly. Well, partly implies not wholly, so the though not wholly can be removed entirely. And then you have a draw between arguments for equality and inequality. You could say, you could cut that down to a draw between equality and inequality, right? Or a draw between arguments, right? You could not make this about arguments specifically between equality and inequality, but you could make this just a draw between arguments generates a presumption that is partly analogous with the three classic ones mentioned above. So already we've cut a lot off of the sentence, for the purposes of looking at how small we could get it. Now here we continue. The burden of proof need not be assigned to one of the parties to the debate. In a draw, neither party could discharge it. Now here you probably can't cut too much. There's a lot. There's not much going on here in these sentences that makes them unnecessarily wordy. Burden of proof is not the same thing as proof, right? Need not be assigned to one of the parties to the debate. Need not be assigned to one of the parties to the debate. I mean, you could get rid of to the debate, because if we're already talking about an argument, then we know that there are parties and that they're in a debate. And so we can just say one of the parties. And then in a draw, neither party could discharge it, or the could there might be doing a little bit more work than it needs to be. Although that's more of a semantic argument. Let's continue. Failing conclusive argument that it ought to be changed, the world of the status quo prevails. Again, this is a pretty simple sentence, so there's not much to cut here. But you could turn conclusive argument to, failing the conclusion that it ought to be changed, the world of the status quo prevails. And you could just say the status quo prevails. It doesn't need to be the world of the status quo prevails. Continuing, if the latter is in relevant respects unequal, it continues to be unequal. If, by virtue of past and present egalitarian policies, it is in relevant respects equal, and the draw leaves it undecided whether this is good or bad, superior or inferior to its alternative, the presumption calls for its being left well alone. Now this is another one of those sentences that just kind of goes off on its own for a minute. So we have, if the latter is in relevant respects unequal, it continues to be unequal. This is reasserting the status quo prevails from the previous sentence. But then we have, if by virtue of past and present egalitarian policies, it is in relevant respects equal, and the draw leaves it undecided whether this is good or bad. He's mixing multiple points here. So, the way that you would cut this down is you would say, if the latter is in relevant respects unequal, it continues to be unequal. And then we don't need to worry about this whole virtue of past and present egalitarian policies, because things could be equal with or without the existence of egalitarian policies. He's needlessly pigeonholing the scope of his statement here, and so we can just avoid that clause altogether. If it is in relevant respects equal, and the draw leaves it undecided, so now he's compounded two sentences into two different arguments, but not one argument per sentence. So what we probably want to do is put a period after, in relevant respects equal, and say this, this is where it gets kind of hard, right? Because if it is in relevant respects equal, then it continues to be equal. In fact, from the previous sentence, we can actually imply that if it is equal, it remains equal, because the whole crux of the argument that's been going on has been, well, does this, if no side has won the argument, then the status quo prevails. So this second sentence isn't even really necessary. And then we've got this additional argument that happens in the middle of or at the end half of this sentence, which really should be its own thing. The draw leaves it undecided whether this is good or bad, superior or inferior to its alternative. The presumption calls for its being left well alone. Well, good or bad are vague words, and superior or inferior to its alternative are specific words for what de Jassé is actually trying to say. So we can get rid of the good or bad part, and we end up with, the draw leaves it undecided whether this is superior or inferior to its alternative. And then you could just say, either way, the presumption calls for its being left well alone. There is no presumption in favor of continuing the maintenance of equalities by continuous redistribution and other related measures meant to prevent inequalities from arising again. So, again, the point getting away from the point that he's trying to make in general, but in this essay, this sentence is, what you would say, without a without a presumption in favor of equality, continuous redistribution, and other related measures there is no presumption in favor of continuing the maintenance of equalities. There is no presumption in favor of maintaining equality or equalities by continuous redistribution, and instead of the other related measures, just and other related measures, period. Because the meant to prevent inequalities from rising again is implied basically as well. So as you can see, in just this one paragraph, if we're really aggressive and really cut things down, we can cut about a third of this paragraph away and really shorten it and really kind of streamline it. A draw between arguments for equality and inequality also presumes or also generates a presumption that is partly analogous with the three classic ones mentioned above. the burden of proof need not be assigned to one of the parties. In a draw, neither party could discharge it. Failing conclusive argument, the world of the status quo prevails. If the latter is in relevant respects unequal, it continues to be so. The draw leaves it undecided whether this is superior or inferior to its alternative, and the presumption calls for its being left well alone. There is no presumption in favor of continuing the maintenance of equalities and other related measures. We've cut almost half of that paragraph, actually. And I'm not saying necessarily that the paragraph that we just kind of cobbled together here is necessarily better than what de Jassé wrote. Far from it. What I'm saying is that overly flowery language in essays especially is something that you can is a hole with no bottom that you can find yourself diving into. And if you aren't careful, you can really destroy the persuasiveness of your argument by making it so flowery, so covered in unnecessary linguistical flourishes that the average person is no longer able to follow the argument. And I'm probably going to do another video at some point about the value of plain language in both essays and fiction. But this is just something that I found very, very frequently in de Jassé's writing, where he kind of says a lot more than he really needs to. It feels padded, if you know what I mean. And that's another thing to avoid. Even if you have a lot of flourishes, and even if they're really good flourishes, in a persuasive essay, you might not want to add them because the average reader might say, this person is being so unnecessarily flowery with their language that I kind of am not sure I believe in their... I sort of start to feel that they're being disingenuous or something like that. Or even sarcastic, honestly. So yeah, this is just kind of a fun observation that I've been making in reading some of de Jassé's work. I get the same thing from like Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is very wordy, and he has these very overly complicated sentence structures that make it very difficult to understand the crux of what he's trying to get to. And so this is super useful in essays, at least as an exercise, because if you do this as an exercise, what'll happen, even if you decide that you like the original lengthier version, the next essay you write, you'll kind of be doing this in the back of your head as you go along, and you'll end up in a situation where you are a little less flowery next time, and maybe a little less flowery the time after. It's a really good exercise that I've used to curb my desire to overly blah 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 in persuasive or fictional writing, and the important point is to try to distinguish between what is necessary and what is color, what is flair. Because sometimes you want flair, right? There are some times where you want a thing to be described in a fanciful way. There are times that you want a character who has this particular habit of being flowery with his words, and this is something that can happen in fiction. There are times that you want to really take your time and look into something that's going on in the world of your story. But there are also times that you want to really get down to the nitty-gritty, to the action of what's going on, to the most important element that your characters are seeing or experiencing, and really hit that like on a bullseye. And this exercise, whatever you want to call it, of being really aggressive and cutting things down, even if you don't use the version that you've cut everything down, it'll help you understand where you're being flowery, and being aware of it means that you can use it to a more appropriate at more appropriate times. And so this is something, and especially because I find a lot of fiction where people are reusing the same words over and over again, or they're going on and on about something that doesn't have any effect on the story. If you find parts of your story where you're like, well, I'm describing this thing, and no, this isn't super interesting, but I do want to describe it. If you use this exercise, you can cut down a lot of your excess stuff. And instead of choosing a phrase of 3 or 4 or 5 words, you can often cut that phrase down to one really specific word if you use a thesaurus, for instance. That's another thing that you can do to kind of shorten things down. Again, you don't necessarily want to shorten everything, but if you find yourself in the habit of writing things longer than they need to be, whether you're doing it for the purposes of school or whether you're doing it for the purposes of your own, your own happiness, whatever. This exercise is something that helps you stop over-wording things, or at least recognize when you're doing it so you can choose to do it when you want to do it and not just do it by default all the time. Because it can be a bad habit, especially if you ever have to write something where you have like a maximum word limit, right? In which case you're going to want your arguments to be as stripped down and on point as possible, as opposed to going on and on and on about how something is partly, but not wholly analogous to something. It's like, well, wait. I mean, if it's partly, then it's definitely not wholly analogous to something, right? These two phrases mean the same thing, and they're right next to each other with commas, and there's no reason for them to be there. So anyway, that's my thoughts for today. Hope you find it useful for any writing that you have to do, whether creative or to some purpose. This is something that you also want to think about if you're doing like copywriting or whatever too, right? Like you want to get right at the pain points of your reader in copy. And if you spend a lot of time blah, blah, blahing, the reader might never get to the point where you actually say, this is why you want this thing. This is why, this thing is important to you. This is the problem this is going to solve for you. No, you put that first, you put it in a short sense, and then later on you maybe get a little bit more flowery when you've already got the person's attention. So anyway, that's what I got for today. I hope you found this interesting. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you tomorrow, I think, with another video. So have a good one.